The restaurant falls silent. Every fork stops mid-bite. Every conversation dies on trembling lips. 200 of the city's elites sit frozen, as music unlike anything they've ever heard pours from the grand piano in the corner. The homeless girl they'd laughed at just moments before is playing Rachmaninoff like she was born to breathe life into those keys. Her dirty fingers dance across ivory with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a poet. Tears stream down faces that moments ago had sneered with disgust. The restaurant manager who tried to throw her out now stands paralyzed, his hands still raised from the slap he'd delivered across her face. "Get out," he'd snarled. "We don't serve your kind here." But she hadn't moved toward the door. She'd moved toward the piano. "Can I play for food?" she'd asked, blood trickling from her split lip. They'd laughed. Oh, how they'd laughed. They had no idea they were about to witness a miracle that would shatter everything they thought they knew about worth, talent, and the power of music to expose the deepest truths about the human soul. This is the story of how one homeless girl's desperate plea became the symphony that changed everything. Let me paint you a picture of invisibility. Every major city has them. The forgotten ones. The people society has decided don't exist. They sleep in doorways, under bridges, in the spaces between our willful blindness and their desperate reality. Keisha was 17 when she became one of the invisible. Not by choice. Never by choice. The system had chewed her up and spit her out more times than most people change jobs. Foster home to foster home. Family to family. Each placement a new disappointment. A fresh wound on a soul already carved hollow by abandonment. But Keisha carried something with her through every move, every rejection, every night spent shivering under cardboard blankets. Music, not in her pocket or her backpack. Those got stolen or confiscated too many times to count. The music lived somewhere deeper. In her bones, in her heartbeat, in the way her fingers moved across invisible keys, even when she was sleeping rough behind dumpsters. You see, Keisha had been born with a gift so rare that most people spend lifetimes searching for just a fraction of what flowed through her naturally. Perfect pitch. Photographic musical memory. Hands that could make a piano weep or sing or roar with just the right touch. But gifts mean nothing when you're homeless at 17. When your last foster family kicked you out for behavioral issues. Translation. You wouldn't let their drunk uncle put his hands where they didn't belong. When you're sleeping in subway tunnels and digging through garbage for your next meal. The night that changed everything started like all the others. Keisha was hungry. Not the kind of hungry that makes you crave a snack. The kind that makes your stomach eat itself. That makes you dizzy when you stand up too fast. That makes every step feel like you're walking through quicksand. She'd been on the streets for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of being invisible to everyone except the police who moved her along, and the predators who saw a young girl alone and thought they'd found easy prey. But Keisha had learned to fight, had learned to run, had learned to survive. What she hadn't learned was how to stop the music in her head. Even when she was at her lowest, melodies played behind her eyes. Symphonies built themselves in her dreams. Her fingers still moved across those invisible keys, playing concerts for audiences that existed only in her imagination. That night, walking past the windows of Sterling's, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, Keisha heard something that stopped her cold. A piano, a beautiful grand piano sitting in the corner of the dining room, surrounded by wealthy patrons who probably couldn't tell Mozart from elevator music. The piano sat silent while people with more money than most countries' GDP picked at their overpriced meals and complained about their trivial problems. It was like watching a thoroughbred horse locked in a stable while children rode stick ponies. Something inside Keisha snapped. She pushed through the heavy glass doors before her rational mind could stop her. The maitre d' spotted her immediately. Torn jeans, dirty sneakers with holes that let the cold seep through to her bones. A hoodie that had seen better decades. Hair that hadn't been properly washed in a week. She looked exactly like what she was. A homeless teenager who had no business in a restaurant where appetizers cost more than most people's rent. "Excuse me." His voice dripped with a kind of disdain that only comes from years of believing your job title makes you better than other human beings. "This is a private establishment." Keisha's eyes never left the piano. "I know. I'm not here to eat." "Then you need to leave. Now." But Keisha had spent 3 weeks being moved along, pushed out, told to leave. 3 weeks of being treated like human garbage by people who'd never missed a meal in their lives. And she was tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of being worthless. Tired of carrying this music inside her with nowhere to let it out. "Can I play for food?" The words fell from her lips like a prayer. The maitre d' blinked. "Excuse me? Your piano." Keisha pointed to the instrument that sat gleaming and silent. "Can I play it? Just one song. For a meal." And that's when the laughter started. Not cruel laughter. At first, more like the kind of chuckling adults do when children say something adorably naive. The kind of patronizing amusement that cuts deeper than outright cruelty. "Honey," said a woman in pearls who probably spent more on jewelry than most families spent on housing. "That's a concert grand piano. It's not a toy." "Maybe try McDonald's," suggested her companion, not even looking up from his lobster. "They might have a toy piano in their playpen." More laughter. Whispers. Smartphones coming out to record the homeless girl who thought she could play classical music. The restaurant manager materialized like a shark smelling blood in the water. Marcus Thompson, a man who'd climbed his way up from poverty himself, but had somehow convinced himself that made him better than the people still struggling. That his success gave him the right to look down on anyone who reminded him of where he came from. "You need to leave," he said, grabbing Keisha's arm. "Right now. Please." Keisha's voice cracked. "Just one song. I won't bother anyone. I need to play." There was something in her voice. Something desperate and real that cut through the dinner conversation like a blade. For just a moment, the laughter died. But Marcus Thompson was a man who'd built his reputation on maintaining standards. On keeping people like Keisha out so people with money could eat in comfort without being reminded that poverty existed. His hand came down across her face with a sound that echoed through the restaurant like a gunshot. "I said get out. We don't serve your kind here." Keisha's head snapped to the side. Blood trickled from her split lip. The restaurant fell silent except for the whispered commentary of people recording her humiliation for their social media feeds. What would you have done in that moment? Walked away with whatever dignity you had left? Fought back and probably gotten arrested? Or would you have done what Keisha did next? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what happened next defied every expectation in that room. Instead of heading toward the door, Keisha walked toward the piano. "I said leave," Marcus shouted, but something in Keisha's movement stopped him cold. She didn't walk like a beaten homeless girl anymore. She walked like someone who just remembered exactly who she was. Her fingers touched the keys, and the world held its breath. The first note cut through the silence like lightning through darkness. Pure, perfect, impossible. Keisha's bloodied fingers found their home on keys she'd never touched before, but her muscle memory knew every curve, every weight, every subtle resistance. She started with Chopin, Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece so beautiful and technically demanding that most concert pianists spend years perfecting it. Keisha played it like she was having a conversation with an old friend. The restaurant patrons sat frozen. Smartphones stopped recording as people forgot they were holding them. The soft clink of silverware against china died completely. Because what was happening wasn't possible. Homeless teenagers didn't play Chopin with the precision of conservatory graduates. Street kids didn't possess the technical mastery that required decades of expensive lessons and world-class instruction. But here was Keisha, transforming a corner of an overpriced restaurant into Carnegie Hall with nothing but her gift and her desperate need to prove she was more than the world's worst assumptions about her. The Chopin melted seamlessly into Debussy, Clair de Lune floating through the air like moonlight made audible. Keisha's eyes were closed now, lost in a world where she wasn't homeless or hungry or bleeding from a manager's cruel slap. In this world, she was what she'd always been, a musician. Marcus Thompson stood paralyzed, his raised hands still frozen in the aftermath of violence he now desperately wished he could take back. Because he was looking at something that shouldn't exist. Pure talent. Raw genius. The kind of musical gift that comes along maybe once in a generation, coming from a girl he'd just assaulted for the crime of asking for food. But Keisha wasn't done. The Debussy transformed into Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most technically challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. A piece that separates the merely talented from the truly transcendent. Keisha played it from memory. Every note perfect. Every dynamic precisely controlled. Every emotional beat landing with the force of a revelation. People began to weep. Not pretty, dignified tears. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere primal. The kind of emotion that hits when you witness something so beautiful and true that it rewires your understanding of what's possible. The woman in pearls who'd mocked Keisha covered her mouth with shaking hands. The man who'd suggested McDonald's put down his fork and stared at the girl whose talent dwarfed anything he'd ever accomplished. And in that moment, every person in that restaurant understood they were witnessing something historic. Not just a performance, a reckoning. How many times had they walked past homeless people without seeing them? How many times had they made assumptions about worth based on appearances? How many Keishas had they dismissed because poverty was easier to ignore than to acknowledge? If stories like this shake your soul the way they shake mine, then don't just watch. Subscribe to Black Nation. Because we've got more untold stories of triumph that the world needs to hear. Keisha transitioned into her final piece, something she'd never heard played by anyone else, because she'd composed it herself during those long nights in shelters and doorways. It was called Invisible, and it told the story of every forgotten child, every discarded dreamer, every person society had decided wasn't worth seeing. It started soft, tender, the musical equivalent of a whisper from someone who'd learned that speaking too loudly meant getting silenced. Then it built, layer by layer, voice by voice, all the invisible people finding their power, finding their worth, finding their voice. The melody soared and crashed and climbed again, carrying with it every pain and hope and dream that lived in the shadows of a world too busy to notice its most precious gifts. By the time Keisha played the final note, there wasn't a dry eye in the restaurant. The silence that followed was deafening. Then one person started clapping, a single pair of hands applauding in the stunned quiet. It was an elderly black woman sitting at a corner table. Someone who'd probably seen enough of the world to recognize true greatness when it walked into a room, wearing torn clothes and carrying invisible instruments. Her applause was joined by another, then another. Then the entire restaurant erupted in an ovation that shook the windows. People were on their feet, weeping, cheering, trying to process what they'd just experienced. But Keisha wasn't looking at them anymore. She was looking at Marcus Thompson, the man who'd slapped her, who tried to throw her out like garbage, who was now crying harder than anyone in the room. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but the words were lost in the thunderous applause. Keisha stood up from the piano bench, walked over to where he stood trembling, and she said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "All I wanted was a chance to play for food. You could have just said yes." What happened next transformed everything. Not just for Keisha, For everyone who witnessed it. For everyone who would later watch the videos that started appearing online within hours. Because in that age of smartphones and social media, Keisha's performance didn't stay contained within the walls of Sterling's restaurant. The videos spread like wildfire. Homeless girl plays piano like an angel. She asked to play for food. What happened next will restore your faith in humanity. The performance that made a whole restaurant cry. But it wasn't just the performance that captured hearts around the world. It was the story, the context, the raw injustice of a girl with the talent of angels being treated like street trash by people who couldn't carry her musical shoes. Within 24 hours, Keisha's story had reached millions. Record labels called. Concert halls offered bookings. Music schools competed to offer full scholarships to the girl who'd played Rachmaninoff after being slapped by a restaurant manager. But the most important call came from someone Keisha never expected. Dr. Patricia Williams, the director of the most prestigious music conservatory in the country. A woman who'd spent her life identifying and nurturing musical genius. "I saw your video," she said when she finally tracked down Keisha through social services. "I've been in music education for 30 years. I've never seen anything like what you did." Keisha was sitting in a youth shelter, still processing what had happened, still not quite believing that her desperate plea for food had become the performance heard around the world. "I know this might sound overwhelming," Dr. Williams continued, "but I'd like to offer you something. Full scholarship, room and board, private lessons with the best instructors in the world." Keisha's voice was barely a whisper. "Why?" "Because talent like yours doesn't come along once in a lifetime. It comes along once in a century, and the world deserves to hear what you have to say." But Dr. Williams wasn't the only one calling. Forget what they'd witnessed. How do you serve overpriced meals to wealthy patrons when you've seen what real value looks like? How do you maintain the fiction that money equals worth when you've watched a homeless teenager reveal the hollowness of such beliefs? The space was eventually converted into a community music center. Free lessons for anyone who wanted to learn. Instruments available for people who couldn't afford their own. A place where musical dreams weren't limited by economic realities. Above the entrance, they installed a plaque with Keisha's words from that night. "All I wanted was a chance to play for food." But the most lasting impact of Keisha's story wasn't institutional. It was personal, individual, heart by heart, mind by mind, soul by soul. Every person who watched those videos, who heard her story, who witnessed that impossible performance, carried something away with them. A question that lingered long after the music stopped. How many times have I looked at someone and seen only what they lack instead of what they possess? How many gifts have I dismissed because they came wrapped in poverty? How many voices have I silenced because they didn't sound like what I expected greatness to sound like? Legacy like this deserves to be remembered. Subscribe to Black Nation, and let's keep stories like Keisha's alive together. The ripple effects of that single performance continued for decades. Keisha's foundation grew into a global movement. Music programs in underserved communities worldwide. Scholarships for students who'd been written off by traditional education systems. Instruments in the hands of children who'd never dreamed they could make music. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real impact was in the individual lives transformed. The foster kid who discovered she had perfect pitch. The homeless veteran who found healing through guitar lessons. The refugee child who learned to express trauma through violin strings. Each of them carrying forward Keisha's lesson. That talent doesn't require a trust fund. Genius doesn't need a pedigree. And the most beautiful music often comes from the most broken places. Keisha herself became more than a musician. She became a voice for the voiceless. A reminder that society's throwaway people might be its greatest treasures. a living example of what happens when we see past circumstances to the essence of human potential. Her autobiography, titled Invisible No More, became a bestseller that crossed cultural and economic lines. Parents read it to understand the children they might be overlooking. Teachers used it to recognize students they'd written off. Social workers carried it as a reminder of why their work mattered. But perhaps the most powerful testament to Keisha's impact came in the form of a letter. A handwritten note from a 13-year-old girl in foster care. "Dear Ms. Keisha, I saw your video and it made me cry. Not because it was sad, but because it was hope. I've been in 7 different homes, and everyone tells me I'm too much trouble. But I love music, and I have dreams, and your story makes me think maybe dreams don't die just because people stop believing in them. Maybe they just wait for the right moment to come alive. Thank you for showing me that invisible doesn't mean worthless. That homeless doesn't mean hopeless. That being thrown away doesn't mean you can't throw yourself back into the fight. I'm going to keep singing until someone hears me. I'm going to keep dreaming until someone sees me. Because if you can go from sleeping in doorways to playing on stages, then maybe there's hope for all of us invisible kids. Maybe we're not broken. Maybe we're just waiting for our moment to shine." That letter, which Keisha kept framed on her piano, represented millions of similar stories. Children who saw themselves in her struggle and found courage to continue. Adults who recognized their own biases and chose to change. Communities that decided to look closer at the people they'd been trained to overlook. The restaurant industry itself began to change. Training programs started including modules on recognizing and respecting human dignity regardless of economic status. The phrase, "we don't serve your kind," became career suicide in hospitality. Marcus Thompson, despite losing his management career, became one of the most effective advocates for homeless services in the city. His lived experience of being the villain in Keisha's story gave him unique insight into how cruelty spreads and how it can be stopped. "I know what it feels like to be the worst version of yourself," he would tell groups of hospitality workers. "I know how easy it is to let power make you forget humanity. And I know that every day, you have the choice to be the person who crushes dreams or the person who nurtures them." His presentations always ended with the same clip. Keisha at that piano, transforming pain into beauty while blood still stained her lip from his violence. "That girl taught me that grace isn't something you earn," he would say. "It's something you receive. And once you've received it, you have a responsibility to pass it on." But the most remarkable aspect of Keisha's aftermath wasn't what happened to the people who knew her story. It was what happened to people who didn't. To remember, to change. Keisha's music continues to play in concert halls around the world. But it also plays in the quiet moments when someone chooses kindness over cruelty. When someone sees potential instead of problems. When someone offers a chance instead of judgment. That's her real symphony. And it's still being written, note by note, choice by choice, heart by heart. Every time someone asks, "Can I play for food?" and finds a world willing to listen. Like this video, if Keisha's story moved your spirit, share it with someone who needs to remember that circumstances don't define destiny. And subscribe to Black Nation for more stories that prove the impossible is just another word for inevitable. Because these aren't just stories. They're proof that the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, all it takes is someone brave enough to ask for a chance to play.